I'm Kelsey. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I'm wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I'm bringing you a double discussion video of two very chunky, very long fantasy books that I read over a period of many months, and both of which I have very strong feelings about. Now, the first one I absolutely adored, and that was Jonathan Strange Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke. I started reading this in March, finished it in July. I took my time with this because I felt it was, for me, best enjoyed in small doses, and I also didn't want it to end. I give this 5-star rating. If you watched my mid-year book freakout tag, you will know that at the time I filmed that, this was my favorite book I'd read in the year so far. And that the second book here, The Once and Future King by T.H. White, was my least favorite book I've read in the year so far. This was a 1-star rating for me, and it's the first 1-star rating I've given in a really long time. This I read over a long period of time for very different reasons. This is actually a bind-up of 4 books, and I read it as a 4-book series with lots of space in between each book. Although I must admit many times I was sorely tempted to just DNF the thing. I actually started reading this in October of last year. I read The Sword and the Stone in October 2016. I read the second book, The Queen of Darkness, in April of 2017. I read The Ill-Made Knight in June and The Candle in the Wind in July. Now, I wanted to talk about these two books together not just because they were both long-term reading endeavors over a similar period of time, but also because my strong like for one and my strong dislike for the other, I think, make a really interesting point of comparison and contrast, in part because I feel like some of the things that I really liked in this one are not all that different on the surface from some of the things I really disliked in this one. Specifically that they're both very long-winded and somewhat scholarly in tone. So I've been sort of struggling with myself to reconcile my feelings on these two books. Now, that said, I'm going to talk about each of these separately, and I'm going to maybe take a break between filming the 2 parts of this video because it would be a really long time for me to sit trying to say things to the camera otherwise. So first I'm going to talk about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and instead of holding this up because it is extremely heavy, my edition of this is over 1,000 pages, I'm going to set it up here so you can see it like that while I talk about it. Now, while The Once and Future King is a true fantasy classic, I think of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell as a future fantasy classic. It's a historical fantasy novel. It was published in 2004. It's set in the 19th century during the Regency era, during the Napoleonic Wars, and what's really remarkable about it is that it's actually written in a 19th century style, so it's a very immersive reading experience. Now, I've seen discussions on whether you can compare Susanna Clarke's writing to authors like Jane Austen or Charles Dickens. I think what's actually most fascinating is that in many ways she feels like her own authentic 19th century writer. She's not really mimicking any particular one. And I actually think that one of the reasons I enjoyed reading this slowly over a long period of time is that is also how I am most likely to enjoy 19th century literature. That sort of classic is the only other type of book that I ever feel compelled to read like that. Now, this book is an alternate history of English magic centered around the rise of 2 magicians in high society as they vie with each other for prominence in an attempt to restore English magic. We're introduced to an England that has lost its use of practical magic, and all magicians at this point in history are theoretical magicians. They are scholars. They don't actually practice magic. The scholarly pursuit of magic seems very, very tame. It's all about hunting down these very old, very hard to understand texts. These books of magic from days when magic was practiced in England are very old, very hard to find, and it turns out that part of the reason that they're very hard to find is that Mr. Norrell has been hoarding them all. Yes, there is book hoarding in this book, and it's actually a very important part of the story, and that makes me happy, even though you're gonna hate Mr. Norrell for it because his goal in the book hoarding is to keep this knowledge for himself and to keep anyone else from being able to use it. Now, the characters in this book sometimes border on caricature, and none of them more so than Mr. Norrell. He's a reclusive gentleman living in York, and at the beginning of the book, a couple members of the Society of York Magicians discover that he has a claim to being a practical magician, a thing that they have believed no longer existed in England. Mr. Norrell will eventually travel to London in order to gain respectability for English magic, but only, it seems, if the only magician is himself. But as both the title of the book and an obscure prophecy foretell, there will be a second magician, and that is Jonathan Strange. Jonathan Strange is a young gentleman who stumbles upon magic as a profession quite by accident, but proves quite skilled at it. He eventually becomes Mr. Norrell's pupil, and their relationship is equal parts true friendship and bitter rivalry. They are also both deeply, deeply flawed individuals, and this is where things get very interesting. Because as any dedicated fantasy reader will be able to predict, magic is not as tame and biddable as the respectable English would like it to be. And in the face of unbiddable and incomprehensible magic, these two characters behave in very different ways. Strange, over the course of the book, strives to break free of the prohibitions that Norrell puts in place on his studies, and to search further into those dark mysteries. Norrell seems on the surface to be more respectable, but actually proves himself to be something of an insidious hypocrite. Despite very vocally arguing against the use of fairy helpers in magic, upon his arrival in London, Mr. Norrell performs an act of magic for which he must make a bargain with a fairy. And again, this is something that readers of fairy fantasy will know will absolutely never go according to plan. The ramifications of this bad fae bargain are very slow to manifest in this book, but ultimately that's where the real story is. And it's not about these two magicians in their rivalry for glory. It's about all of the people who are invisibly affected and never acknowledged. We have the women of this story. Lady Pole, who is the subject of the magic that Norrell performed. We have Arabella Strange, who is Jonathan Strange's wife. We have lower class characters like Norrell's servant Childermas, whom Norrell continuously underestimates and undervalues. And we have the butler in Sir Walter Pole's household, Stephen Black, who is a black man. This is the cast of characters who are slowly drawn into the consequences of this dark, unfathomable magic, while the men in power seem almost willfully oblivious. And it is frustrating to read at times, but I think it's supposed to be. And while Susanna Clarke writes this book in this very prim and proper tone, every once in a while you do see these glimpses of a 21st century author kind of peeking through the pages at you to point something out. Like what seems almost like a casual throwaway line that of course no one would notice, that the symptoms that were being displayed by the lady of the house were the same as the symptoms being displayed by the Negro butler, and think to connect the two. Of course no one would think that. I do think that a lot of whether or not you're going to enjoy this book will have to do with whether or not you get along with this particular writing style. Because it is a very long book, and you are stuck with this writing style for a very long time. Me, I actually found it hilarious. I was laughing out loud for a lot of this book, and I'm not sure that everyone will find this book comedic, but I did. I find Susanna Clarke's writing to be really, really witty in a sort of scholarly humor sort of way. There are also these incredible footnotes, and I am personally a sucker for a good footnoted fantasy novel. Through these scholarly footnotes, you start to get more and more glimpses of the pieces of the puzzle of this alternate history, sometimes in the form of historical anecdotes that feel almost like fairy tales. And I think one of the delights of this book is actually the gradual reveal of how alternate this history really is. We learn that Northern England was ruled in this alternate history for 300 years by the Raven King, a mortal man raised in fairy. The Raven King comes to embody everything about English magic that Norrell so desperately wishes to erase from history, and everything about the true essence of magic that cannot in the end be ignored. And along with this sort of gradual reveal of the alternate history comes this sort of gradual feeling that it becomes more and more of a fantasy novel as it goes on. I think this book takes a long time lulling you into feeling comfortable and cozy in this writing style that feels like such cheery, good old English literature, as the characters insist that magic is rational and can be understood. And then you stumble into some magical event, into some lyrical passage, and things get crazy and you're like, oh my god, this is a fantasy novel. It's a sort of spine-tingling feeling as every so often this veneer starts to give way. And I will tell you that by the end it picks up enough steam that like the last quarter of the book I sped through and was unable to put it down. So I'm sure there are people who won't have the patience for this book, but I ultimately found it to be really rewarding. I feel like it was constantly reminding me of so many things in the fantasy tradition that I'm familiar with as a reader, while also leaving me feeling like I'd never read anything quite like it before. I'm going to leave you with a portion of the Prophecy of the Raven King, because who doesn't like a good prophecy? Magic shall be written upon the sky by the rain, but they shall not be able to read it. Magic shall be written on the faces of the stony hills, but their minds shall not be able to contain it. In winter the barren trees shall be a black writing, but they shall not understand it. 2 magicians shall appear in England. The first shall fear me, the second shall long to behold me. The first shall be governed by thieves and murderers. The second shall conspire at his own destruction. The first shall bury his heart in a dark wood beneath the snow, yet still feel its ache. The second shall see his dearest possession in his enemy's hand. The first shall pass his life alone. He shall be his own jailer. The second shall tread lonely roads, the storm above his head, seeking a dark tower upon a high hillside. I sit upon a black throne in the shadows, but they shall not see me. The rain shall make a door for me, and I shall pass through it. The stones shall make a throne for me, and I shall sit upon it. The nameless slave shall wear a silver crown. The nameless slave shall be a king in a strange country. Yes, that is what this book is about. Okay, I'm back, and now I'm going to talk about The Once and Future King. Now, this is really intimidating for me because, as I mentioned, I was reading this for an incredibly long time. Between when I started it and now, I've obviously had a whole ton of ideas about what I wanted to say about this book when I eventually talked about it on BookTube, and I'm sure that not half of those are going to end up coming out of my mouth right now. So if you want to talk, I'll definitely be looking forward to having discussions with people in the comments on this book. I'm sure I will have more to say than I actually say in this video. That said, some of the earlier portions of the book I did read a really long time ago, and I'm not going to remember them in great detail. Mostly what I remember is sort of the things that I made note of that I was going to want to say about them. So it's worth noting the period of time over which the books of The Once and Future King were published. I have my laptop here with Goodreads. I'm just gonna read out the information. So, according to Goodreads, The Sword and the Stone was first published in 1938. The Witch in the Wood was the second original book, which was replaced with The Queen of Darkness in the bind-up. The Witch in the Wood was published in 1939. I haven't read it. The Ill-Made Knight was published in 1940, and The Candle in the Wind, it says, was also published in 1940. There is another book, The Book of Merlin, that isn't in The Once and Future King that I have no interest in reading. But the bind-up was not published until 1958, and I don't know if that's an appropriate date to stamp on The Queen of Darkness, or if he actually wrote it previously to then. I'm not really certain. But there are ways in which T.H. White is definitely responding to what were current events in the time. He very obviously hates the Nazis. He takes very direct jabs at Hitler and at the ideas of fascism. And at the time that I was reading this, for most of the time that I was reading this book, that felt like enough of a given that of course we hate the fascists, that it didn't seem worthy of extra praise. My, how times have changed. I still don't feel like hating the Nazis is exceptional enough, or should be considered exceptional enough, that I should give this book extra stars just because of it. I did throughout feel like the philosophizing and the ideas that T.H. White was really trying to write into this book were the best part of it. But as a whole, I consistently found that by today's standards, the writing was just not good or enjoyable, and the portrayals of the characters and some of the attitudes just feel like they don't really hold up for a modern reading experience. So my main critique of this is that it has aged very poorly. I have read fantasy classics that I feel have aged much better. I have read fantasy classics older than this that I feel have aged much better. So I do think I feel justified in talking about what felt really off to me about this book. So I'm going to go through these books one at a time and kind of sum up the things that I remember striking me very strongly about each book, and then I'm going to kind of talk about the writing as a whole. The Sword and the Stone concerns young Arthur, who is known as the Wart. He's growing up with no knowledge of his identity or parentage in the shadow of Kay, who is obviously going to be a knight. The majority of the book concerns Merlin showing up and educating Arthur by turning him for periods of time into various different animals so that he can experience what these animals' societies are like. It's got a pretty pacifist bent as we see which animals it's better to live as, but it's really unsatisfying in terms of character development because it seems like by the end of the book, Arthur has not internalized any of it. This was by far the most lighthearted of the books, and I think I found it the most entertaining. At the end of Sword and the Stone, I was thinking, yeah, that one was maybe 2 stars, but it's just the beginning, so things are going to get more interesting, right? I thought that it was pretty easy reading, actually, but there were several things that I found kind of weird and unlikable about it. First of all, the setting. T.H. White seems to really go out of his way to, like, paint this picture of back in the olden days when the skies were bluer and the trees were greener and people were jollier than they are today. And then, like, it feels like he's trying to tell us that that's actually what the Middle Ages were like, and I was very confused because I'm like, are we thinking of the same Middle Ages? It's also, in retrospect, not particularly consistent with the portrait of medieval times that T.H. White paints in the later books, where he's trying to draw a strict contrast between, like, all of the horrible things you hear about from the Middle Ages were before Arthur's reign, and all of the good things were during Arthur's reign. And he noticed this at one point and said, oh yes, except for that corner of the wood where Arthur grew up. That was perfectly idyllic. It all made it very hard for me to buy into. In terms of the tone of the writing, this was when I first noticed a sort of strict contrast between the times when T.H. White was, like, trying to actually seriously say things that were supposed to be meaningful, and, like, all of the rest of the time when it was very hard to tell, like, this is supposed to be funny, right? This is supposed to be a joke. This isn't funny. It felt like all of the jokes were falling flat. The presence of Merlin, who is portrayed as living backwards and therefore having memories of the future up to what was in T.H. White's day, the present day. So that's where we get some of our scope of human history stuff. It often felt like that aspect of the character was played for laughs, and often I felt like I just didn't get the joke. So this book left me feeling like for some of the more serious stuff, I would rather be reading Tolkien, and for some of the more comedic stuff, I would rather be reading Pratchett. Just the tone of the writing didn't quite hit the mark for me in either regard. And what came up for me in this book and continued to be a problem, I think until The Ill-Made Knight, is that the characters were absolute 100% cardboard cutouts. They didn't feel like real people at all. They were merely vehicles for T.H. White's occasional philosophizing. So this was my dad's copy of the book, and at the end of The Sword and the Stone, I texted him, and his response was something along the lines of, you know, I don't really remember, it's been a long time since I read it. I'm assuming that you're frustrated by the portrayal of the female characters. And my response to that was like, what female characters? There haven't been any yet. To be fair though, Robin Hood and Maid Marian did show up in this book out of nowhere. And Marian was cool for like the half a sec that she was in this story. I should also mention that there were a couple of racist slurs that I think were meant to be hilarious jokes. There was an instance of a hawk using the N-word in a derogatory way, which I think was supposed to be hilarious because how would a hawk know about the N-words? I think I also remember something about the Red Indians and how fake their archery is, and I'm like, whoa, what now? So both of those, I think, intended jokes fell really, really, really flat. So the first book is this long. It ends here. And then the second book, The Queen of Darkness, I think is somewhat shorter. Yeah. Queen of Darkness is only this long, but boy did I despise this second book. So the Queen of Darkness follows two different storylines that don't come together at all until the very end, and neither of which I cared about in the least. So the book starts off in Orkney, where we meet the four brothers. What were their names again? Gawain, Agravain, Gaheris, and Gareth. Those are the ones. They are terrible little kids with an even more terrible mother. Basically, the idea is that their mother Morgause is a witch and a seductress, and therefore a terrible mother. Don't get me started, it's all sorts of crappy. The other storyline follows Arthur, who is now a young king and has evidently learned absolutely nothing from book one because he's having a jolly good war that he thinks is lots of fun. Over the course of the book, Merlin guides him to the revelation that war is not, in fact, jolly good fun for all involved, because the nobility are treating it like a sport without a care for the people who are actually getting killed in the bargain. There was a particularly choice moment toward the beginning where Arthur says to Merlin, "You know, I have just now started to think about right and wrong," and you're like, what were you doing for the entire first book? Also, you're already king, and you're thinking about right and wrong for the first time ever. But despite how obviously dense he is, he eventually has the necessary revelation that might should not equal right, that he should, when the war is over, create the Round Table to prevent the nobility from doing horrible things to people just because they can. It's pretty dang simplistic, but you know, it's a worthy cause. Meanwhile, the Orkney plotline is really downright hard to read because a major theme in it, intentionally, is animal cruelty as a metaphor for human cruelty. So that's how these two plot lines are talking to each other. But if you, like me, have a hard time reading about really graphic animal cruelty in books, you're gonna want to know that this is gonna be tough. We start at the very beginning of the book with Morgause boiling a cat alive because she is bored. We also have like the most graphic and upsetting unicorn slaughter and dismembering. That's just a scene that just goes on way too long, and I couldn't handle it. And yeah, it's a metaphor for what's happening over in the other plot, but it was incredibly graphic, ideologically simplistic. It just didn't work for me. So that's basically all that happens in this book until like the very last page when Morgause uses gruesome sorcery to seduce Arthur, the end. So yeah, in terms of like book structure, it didn't feel like a book. It didn't feel like part of the rest of the book. It felt shoehorned in. I don't know if that had to do with the fact that it was written later, but it just didn't work for me. So book 3, The Ill-Made Knight, is another long one. The Candle in the Wind is going to be another short one. The Ill-Made Knight is, I think, by far the most interesting of all of the books, but I also disliked it just as much as all the others. I will admit, though, that at this point I was kind of like hate reading, so any virtues were not likely to make a strong impression on me, just to let you know. The Ill-Made Knight is largely about Lancelot. I will say this is where we start to get a few characters who are at least somewhat psychologically driven and portrayed, as opposed to just being puppets for the plot and the ideas. This book is deeply concerned with Lancelot's psychology. It still felt really, really weird to me, though. Like, I don't know if this is Freudian or what. There was just a lot of it that made me feel vaguely uncomfortable. So basically, the whole conceit of Lancelot being the ill-made knight is that in T.H. White's portrayal, he is both physically unattractive and also feels fundamentally like there's something deeply wrong with him as a person that's never quite pinned down. This is where I wonder if it's not uncalled for to do a little digging into T.H. White's personal life. From what I gather, Mr. White was ill at ease with his own sexuality. He was probably gay and deeply unhappy about it. And though I feel a little uncomfortable using this information to help me draw conclusions about the book, there were times when I was feeling like, oh, Mr. White, you should, like, figure yourself out a bit before you try to inflict character development and psychology upon these poor, innocent Arthurian characters. And after 2 books of wishing that the characters would be fleshed out a bit, I was not pleased with the way it was done when it was actually given to me. Especially since so much of this through line of Lancelot feeling inadequate is so deeply tied to his sexual and romantic relationships with both Guinevere and Elaine, except for the one point where it's indicated that what might be really wrong with him is a propensity towards mental illness, which is not handled particularly well either. So like, there's this one scene where Lancelot is confronted by both of these women at the same time. He goes mad on the spot, jumps out a window, disappears, is assumed dead until much later when he's discovered, like, rampaging through the countryside as a wild man who's totally forgotten who he is and where he came from. And I'm like, what? I'm also tempted to mention as a side note that before Guinevere comes on the scene, Lancelot's love and admiration for Arthur was depicted in a way that I was not totally convinced was platonic. But back to Guinevere and Elaine, the long-awaited female characters who aren't evil witches. T.H. White does go out of his way to portray them both as sympathetic characters. You're supposed to sympathize with them. You're supposed to like both of them. You're supposed to understand where both of them are coming from. And yet, throughout, the fundamental role of all women in this story is to bring about the downfall of great men. And even though T.H. White clearly calls upon us to sympathize with these female characters, it's pretty clear that this is his interpretation of Arthurian legend. And he seeks to portray this as a fundamental element of Arthurian legend, even when he takes the trouble to point out that it's specifically cruel to these 2 characters. This ties in a lot to the themes of religion in this book with regards to the quest for the Holy Grail. And it's one of those instances where I can kind of see and respect what an author is doing, even if I didn't enjoy it at all. So at this point in the story, Arthur has achieved an idyllic sort of peace, a complete turnaround that I mentioned before from these long-winded descriptions of how barbarous life was before he came to power and how peaceful and prosperous life is now. He has achieved this by directing the Knights of the Round Table towards chivalry, to turn that need for these hot-headed men to assert their might to the good instead of to war and chaos and plunder. But now that idyllic peace has been achieved in long, rambling passages that are dry as dust to read, that might has run out of good to do, and Arthur needs to come up with some new thing to direct his knights toward so that they won't start plundering again. And so he sends them off on the search for the Holy Grail. In terms of the elements of fantasy in this book that are actually magical, in book 3, all of the elements that are supernatural, that are fantastical, are religious. This is a story that fundamentally has to assume that Christianity is true and that miracles are real and can happen in the course of the story for the story to function at all. That said, T.H. White was an atheist, and it's pretty clear in his retelling that he doesn't think that the demands of purity that God and this quest impose upon the characters is at all humane. And that's actually a really interesting discussion, and it's something that's worth thinking about in this book. But as a side effect, we continue to get really crappy use of women in this narrative. Sexual purity and male virginity are imposed by divine will as requirements for those seeking the Grail, and of course in this Lancelot fails miserably. Arthur, who by the way is still a completely two-dimensional character with no personality, is generally the good guy in every situation, and he, in his compassionate understanding is willing to turn a blind eye to Lancelot and Guinevere's affair, but God is not willing to do so, and neither is, ironically, the law. It is suggested that one of Arthur's sort of crowning glories is that he has basically single-handedly invented the rule of law, and it comes back to bite him. But along the way with this quest for the Holy Grail, we get all of these bizarre anecdotes of women throwing themselves at these knights, like begging for sex, because they are divine tests that the men have to avoid temptation in order to pass. You get one really strange story about these, like, women begging for sex who, after being turned down, like, turn back into the hell demons that they actually are and dissolve back into the earth, and it's really, really bizarre. So again, kind of like book 2, while I was willing to engage in the ideas that T.H. White was trying to talk about, the execution just left a really bad taste in my mouth all the way. I'm also going to say, because I am feeling snarky, that this is the book, The Ill-Made Knight is the book in this book with all of the jousting in it, and I cannot possibly fathom any author making vast amounts of jousting any more soul-numbingly boring than T.H. White did. Like, how did you make jousting this boring? It's jousting! Part, but only part of how he made jousting this boring, is that he was continuously comparing it to cricket. Now, I'm a 21st century American. I would not recognize cricket if the best team in England were playing it in my living room. So the use of cricket as a comparison to talk about the technique and relevance of jousting fell totally flat on me. And I think this is just one example of an overall stylistic thing that didn't work for me with the writing of The Once and Future King as a whole. T.H. White is constantly kinda trying to be the cool dude writer with modern references to make this old-fashioned-y medieval stuff super relevant, and his super hip modern references are all out of date, and so I didn't get any of them, and I just felt bored and confused. Similarly with his constant interjections of Arthurian scholarship and medieval scholarship, half the time I didn't know whether he was referencing an actual source or actual historical research and context that I should have recognized and wasn't getting, or whether he was just making stuff up. But either way, there's all of this ultimately tangential material that did absolutely nothing for me, sometimes made me feel dumb, and other times felt randomly offensive for no reason. As an example of one of this sort of incident that was more on the offensive side, I'm going to read you a passage that I actually posted on Twitter. So I know some of you already saw it because some of you replied to it like, what the heck is this? This is from The Ill-Made Knight. One ridiculous accident, which happened about this time, is worth mentioning, not because it had any consequences or antecedents, but because it is somehow the sort of thing which happened to Lancelot. He behaved about it in his own way. So first of all, he just admitted that it's a totally irrelevant tangent. I want to point that out. He was lying on his stomach in a wood one day, with what sad thoughts nobody knows, when a lady archer came by who was hunting. It does not say whether she was a masculine sort of lady with a mustache and gentleman's neckwear, or whether she was one of those scatterbrains from the film world who do archery because it is so cute. Anyway, she saw Lancelot, and she thought he was a rabbit. On the whole, she must have been one of the masculine ladies, for although it is a pretty trait to shoot at men in mistake for rabbits, it would have been unusual for a film star to hit the mark. Lancelot, bounding to his feet with about 6 inches of arrow embedded in his rump, behaved exactly like Colonel Bogey, driven into the second tee at golf. See if you can make heads or tails of that, if you will. Basically, it had nothing to do with anything, and that sort of tangent is exactly why I got so dang frustrated with this book. It's probably time for me to start talking about The Candle in the Wind. Even though this is the one I read most recently, I've honestly forgotten which things happened specifically in this book. I feel like I might have accidentally sort of lumped a lot of these events into The Ill-Made Knight in my head. As far as I remember, this is basically just the end. What I particularly remember taking a strong dislike to is the portrayal of Mordred. He's depicted in this as being hunchbacked in a way that was strongly reminiscent of Richard III, so that immediately raised red flags for portrayals of deformity and villainhood. If you haven't seen Jen Campbell's videos on this subject, you should check them out. The other thing that I really didn't like about the portrayal of Mordred was the psychoanalytical side of things, where basically he's supposed to be messed up because of his mother and he has all these mommy issues. Of course, this is Morgause again. Everything about the portrayal of her is consistently crappy. It is insinuated that Mordred hates Arthur because he is in love with his mother, Morgause, and is therefore jealous of Arthur, his father. T.H. White should have just stayed away from psychoanalysis in this book. It just gets weirder and weirder. As I've mentioned, though, throughout, all of the philosophizing on Arthur's struggle for a peaceful and prosperous society and what needs to happen to make that happen is the best part of The Once and Future King as a whole. He gets a bit repetitive about it from book to book, and instead of these ideas being sort of deeply embedded in the story itself, it just sort of comes at you occasionally at ideological thought dumps. The very last chapter of Candle in the Wind actually summarizes all of that pretty dang well. So if you're interested in what T.H. White's basic main idea is behind The Once and Future King, you could probably just read the last chapter of The Candle in the Wind, which is basically Arthur thinking back on his great project, and you would get everything you needed to get from just like those few pages. The main takeaway is all there. So I basically felt like The Once and Future King, could have been half the length it was. There's a whole lot that seemed either irrelevant or I didn't get it, and it seemed to me like an editor should have just had at this and chopped out like half the sentences, and the book would have been just fine, maybe better. Which is why I feel like it's such a stark contrast with Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which is actually a significantly longer book that I loved every wordy word of. So what's up with this? I would like to posit a somewhat controversial argument that Susanna Clarke is just a better writer than T.H. White. I did text my dad again after finishing all of The Once and Future King, being like, this book was crap, why did you give me this book to read? And his argument was sort of that, well, at the time this was written, there wasn't really much fantasy genre stuff at all that was widely available for anyone to read. So this just seemed like the bee's knees in comparison to absolutely nothing. So okay, we're back to what I said at the very beginning of when I started talking about this, that I just don't think it has aged well. And who knows, maybe for whatever reason today's great fantasy novels won't age well either. But my job as a booktuber and a book recommender is to tell you folks, quite honestly, you folks watching me in 2017, which of the books I read I think might be worth your time. And of these two, I would say definitely Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, and not The Once and Future King. You know what it feels like? It feels like Susanna Clarke is the professor of the college class that you think is going to be dry and boring, but then somehow she makes everything absolutely fascinating. And T.H. White is like your stuffy old professor who thinks he knows everything and is entirely condescending and absolutely cannot fathom why these kids are texting under the desk in the back of his class. Or maybe he doesn't even notice that the kids are texting under the desk in the back of the class. That is how I feel about the writing style of these two books. As a final note, I think I should point out that even though these are both, they're very hefty tomes that are fundamentally about historical England and fantastical versions of historical England. They are different kinds of fantasy novels. Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell is a fantasy of manners, and it is also a fairy or fae fantasy. And those are both things that I really, really enjoy, and this just does both of those so exquisitely well. The Once and Future King is an Arthurian retelling, and it's considered by many to be the definitive Arthurian retelling. But I have never been particularly drawn to Arthurian legend or Arthurian fantasy. There just isn't any element of this story that I've been exposed to that I feel excited enough about, that I really care about finding new versions of it, or better retellings, or things that will, subvert preconceived ideas about it. So far, I've just never found anything about the Arthurian cast of characters or the Arthurian story that really grabs me. And I am always open to the possibility that I will read some Arthurian retelling in the future that will absolutely captivate me, that I'll get super pumped about, that will make me say, ah, this is the Arthurian story I've been waiting for. But so far it hasn't happened, and so this is not like a comfort zone type of fantasy for me in the first place, whereas Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell really was. So I am sure that there are things about both of these books, because they're both very long and I had lots of thoughts about both of them while reading them, that didn't make it into this video. I would definitely love to chat with you guys in the comments if you've read either of them, if you agree with me, if you disagree with me, if you want to talk about specific things about either of these books. I would be happy to talk, in part because I am sure there are things that weren't in this video that are absolutely worth having a discussion about. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.